Naomi's bitter season was not her final chapter. Naomi asked Bethlehem to stop using her name. "Do not call me Naomi," she said. "Call me Mara." The women of the town had known her before Moab, before the graves, before the road back without her husband and sons. They looked at the woman who returned and asked, "Is this Naomi?" She answered by giving them a different name, one shaped by the bitter providence she believed had overtaken her. The book of Ruth records that request clearly. Then it quietly refuses to follow it. The next verse does not say, "So Mara returned from the country of Moab." It says, "So Naomi returned." The narrator keeps calling her Naomi through every remaining chapter. Her bitterness is neither corrected at once nor hidden from the story, yet it is never permitted to replace her name. That small literary choice raises a question larger than wordplay. What does Scripture do with a woman whose grief has become an interpretation of God, herself, and everything still ahead? Does restoration begin when she retracts her complaint? Does she have to explain why the losses were necessary? Does the story demand that Mara become pleasant again before covenant kindness can reach her? Ruth gives no public recanting from Naomi. Instead, it lets us listen to her language change. Before she called herself Mara, she could still bless others. Later, she could name kindness she had once believed absent. Then she could imagine rest for Ruth, counsel patience without controlling the outcome, and finally receive the words of her community without supplying a final speech of her own. Naomi's last chapter is not announced by one triumphant sentence. It becomes visible in what she is able to say, what she is able to seek, and at last, in what she no longer needs to explain. Before she said Mara, she still spoke blessing. Naomi's harshest words are not her first words in the book. On the road from Moab, before Bethlehem hears her call herself bitter, Naomi speaks blessing over Ruth and Orpah. "May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." The order is important. Naomi has already buried Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion. She is not offering comfort from a protected life. She is a widow speaking to two younger widows, while the future has narrowed around all three of them. She believes she has no sons, no security, and no reasonable path through which these women can build new households by remaining with her. So she urges them to return. Her reasoning is bleak, but her blessing is not empty religious language. She remembers the covenant name of the Lord. She asks him to show kindness. She desires rest for women whose loyalty has already cost them dearly. The Hebrew word often translated kindly is related to hesed, the language of steadfast, committed love. Naomi believes her own life has been struck by severe loss, yet she can still pray that the Lord's covenant kindness will meet someone else. This does not mean bitterness has left her untouched. It reveals that bitterness has not consumed every part of her. Grief is rarely as simple as one emotional condition occupying the whole soul. A person can feel abandoned and still ask God to protect someone else. They can struggle to recognize mercy in their own story while speaking mercy over another person. They can have wounded theology and still remember the vocabulary of faith. Naomi's blessing exposes that complexity. She does not say, "Remain with me because God will certainly restore everything." She gives no promise she has not received. In fact, she believes separation may be the most loving future she can offer. Her counsel is limited by what she can see, but her desire for Ruth and Orpah is generous. Even her insistence that they leave is not driven by contempt for them. Naomi does not want their loyalty to become a lifelong sentence of widowhood beside her. She has begun interpreting herself as a place where other people's futures end. That is what grief has done to her imagination. She can pray for rest, she cannot imagine herself participating in it. When Ruth refuses to leave, Naomi eventually stops arguing. Scripture does not tell us that Ruth's declaration immediately changes Naomi's outlook. Ruth binds herself to Naomi, Naomi's people, and Naomi's God. But Naomi reaches Bethlehem still speaking as if she has returned with nothing. The tension is painful because both realities stand in the same frame. Naomi has been loved with unusual loyalty. Naomi still feels empty. Scripture does not solve that tension by accusing her of ingratitude. Ruth's presence cannot be used to erase Elimelech, Mahlon, or Chilion. People are not replacements for one another. Grief knows the difference between the person who stayed and the people who died. Yet the blessing on the road shows that Mara is not the whole truth about Naomi. Before she rejects her own name, she has already spoken hesed and rest over someone else. The book preserves those words because restoration will later return to both of them. Kindness. Rest. Naomi cannot yet see how either could belong to her household. But they have not disappeared from her speech, and the story will bring them back when her horizon begins to widen. Call me Mara was a verdict spoken from inside the wound. When Naomi and Ruth arrive in Bethlehem, the whole town is stirred. The women ask, "Is this Naomi?" Naomi answers with a compressed theology of her suffering. "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" Her speech moves beyond sadness. She names God as the active subject of her loss. The Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. The Lord has brought me back empty. The Lord has testified against me. The Almighty has brought calamity upon me. Naomi is not speaking as a detached theologian. She is speaking as a woman whose household has collapsed. The deaths remain unexplained. The future appears economically and socially fragile. She has returned to the town that remembers who left, and the difference between then and now is visible enough to make the women ask whether she is really the same person. Call me Mara is her attempt to make the name fit the evidence. Naomi is associated with pleasantness. Mara means bitter. The old name now feels dishonest to her. She does not want the community to use a word that belongs to a life she no longer possesses. Scripture does not interrupt her. No prophet steps forward to correct her doctrine. No narrator inserts a rebuke. Ruth does not tell her to be more thankful. The text allows Naomi's words to remain severe because biblical faith is not protected by silencing the wounded. Still, the narrator does not surrender the story to Naomi's verdict, so Naomi returned. The refusal is quiet. The narrator does not argue that Naomi should feel pleasant. It simply continues to identify her by the name she rejected. This distinction is central to the passage. Naomi's speech tells the truth about how loss has altered her experience. It does not tell the whole truth about who she is or what God is still doing. The story can honor the first truth without granting it authority over the second. Pain often tries to cross that boundary. A season of rejection becomes the name unwanted. A failed responsibility becomes useless. A family fracture becomes alone. A long illness becomes burden. The movement happens almost without notice. Something painful occurred. Then the pain began functioning as identity. Naomi's speech shows why that movement is understandable. The narrator's language shows why it must remain incomplete. The book does not say grief is an illusion. Naomi did go away with a husband and 2 sons and return without them. The later chapters will not resurrect those who died. Even the joy at the end will not make the graves unnecessary or good. But neither does the book accept that grief has the authority to rename Naomi forever. There is another restraint in the narrator's response. Scripture does not immediately show Naomi being proven wrong. Ruth 1 closes with a simple temporal note. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. The harvest is not yet an answer. No grain has reached Naomi's home. No Redeemer has acted. No new household has been formed. The season has merely begun. This is how the story protects Naomi from a shallow reversal. It does not move from Mara to visible fullness in one scene. The change will be slower, and much of it will be heard in Naomi's own words before the external resolution arrives. At Bethlehem, she speaks as if God's action can be summarized by calamity. The next time the book records her interpreting events, another word will enter her vocabulary: Kindness. Naomi's vocabulary changed before her circumstances were settled. Ruth goes out to glean and returns at the end of the day carrying grain and food left from the meal Boaz gave her. Naomi begins with questions. Where did you glean today? Where have you worked? Then she blesses the unnamed man who noticed Ruth. When Ruth identifies him as Boaz, Naomi says, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." The sentence deserves careful attention. Translations and interpreters differ over whether whose kindness points most directly to the Lord or to Boaz. The ambiguity does not weaken the moment. In either reading, Naomi is recognizing covenant faithfulness within what has happened. Boaz's conduct has become evidence that kindness has not vanished from the world of the living or from the obligations connected to the dead. That is a remarkable change in speech. At the end of chapter 1, Naomi said the Lord had brought her back empty and testified against her. In chapter 2, she speaks of kindness that has not forsaken. The story does not tell us that she withdraws the earlier words. It does not require her to say, "I was wrong about everything." Her language becomes larger instead. Calamity is no longer the only category through which she can read God's dealings. Hesed has entered the sentence again. This turn occurs before the story is resolved. Ruth and Naomi are still vulnerable. Boaz has shown generosity, but no marriage has been proposed. The nearer Redeemer has not been addressed. The future of Elimelech's household remains uncertain. Naomi is not praising God from the final page. She is recognizing a particular act of faithfulness in the middle. That is different from optimism. Optimism might say everything will now work out. Naomi says something more grounded. Kindness has not forsaken. She can name what has actually become visible without claiming to know everything it will mean. The grain itself is not the deepest discovery. The change is in Naomi's interpretation. She once spoke as if the Almighty's action toward her could be read entirely as affliction. Now she recognizes that covenant loyalty is also active, even though the losses remain, and the future is unfinished. The text does not describe an emotional breakthrough. There is no announcement that Naomi feels healed. Her theology begins to reopen through attention to what has happened in front of her. Ruth was protected. Ruth was fed. Ruth was allowed to gather abundantly. The man responsible is connected to their family and its obligations. These facts do not answer why Naomi suffered. They challenge the conclusion that suffering has placed her outside every form of kindness. There is maturity in the way the book handles this change. Naomi is not asked to reinterpret the deaths as hidden blessings. God's faithfulness does not depend on calling evil good or loss harmless. Hesed appears beside grief, not in place of it. That is why this section of Ruth speaks differently from easy testimonies. Naomi's later recognition does not invalidate her earlier lament. It reveals that lament, spoken from within a narrowed horizon, could not contain the entire covenant story. A wounded person may not be ready to make a large declaration about God's purpose. Scripture does not demand one here. Naomi begins with a smaller, more textually grounded recognition. Kindness has not forsaken. That sentence creates room for a future she could not imagine at Bethlehem's entrance. The woman who told Ruth and Orpah to seek rest far from her will soon speak of rest again. This time, she will no longer assume that love requires her to remove herself from the possibility. "Should I not seek rest for you?" marked the return of agency. Naomi uses the language of rest twice in the book. On the road from Moab, she prayed that Ruth and Orpah would find rest in the homes of new husbands. At that point, she believed rest could only be found by leaving her. In Ruth 3, she says to Ruth, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" The concern is the same. The posture is different. Naomi has moved from releasing Ruth because she sees no future to participating in the search for Ruth's future. She has not acquired wealth or legal authority. She cannot command Boaz, remove the nearer Redeemer, or guarantee the result. What has returned is her ability to act within limits. That is one of the clearest signs that bitterness is no longer defining every part of her life. At Bethlehem, Naomi described herself as the object of calamity. Things had been done to her. The Almighty had dealt with her, brought her back, testified against her, and brought calamity upon her. By chapter 3, Naomi is once again a speaking subject. She observes, she remembers family relationships, she gives counsel, she seeks another person's good. Her restoration becomes visible as agency before it appears as celebration. This is easy to overlook because we often expect healing to announce itself through emotion. We look for confidence, happiness, or a testimony that sounds complete. Ruth traces a quieter change. Naomi begins using wisdom again. The plan surrounding the threshing floor is culturally distant and should not be flattened into a modern romantic formula. Ruth remains vulnerable. Boaz's integrity matters. Another man has a prior claim that must be addressed. Naomi cannot manufacture redemption by strategy, but she can recognize that Boaz's actions have revealed character, and she can help Ruth move toward a lawful possibility rather than remain trapped in indefinite uncertainty. After Ruth returns and reports what happened, Naomi says, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest but will settle the matter today." This is not prophetic certainty. Naomi does not claim that God privately told her the outcome. She reads the situation from what Boaz has said and from the integrity he has already shown. Her counsel combines participation and restraint. Act where action is possible. Wait where the matter now belongs to someone else. Earlier in the story, Naomi's inability to see a path led her to conclude that no path existed through her. Now she can distinguish between what she knows, what she can do, and what she must leave unresolved for the moment. That is discernment returning. Bitterness often creates two opposite temptations. One is passivity. Nothing can change, so nothing is worth doing. The other is control. Because loss has made life unsafe, every remaining outcome must be managed. Naomi's words in chapter 3 belong to neither extreme. She seeks rest for Ruth. She offers what wisdom she has. Then she tells Ruth to wait. The woman whose future once looked closed can now imagine another person's well-being without claiming power over every detail. Her love is no longer expressed only by sending Ruth away from her emptiness. It is expressed by remaining present and using what she knows. The bitter season has not made Naomi young again, restored her former household, or given her command over the story. It has not erased her usefulness either. Her voice has moved from "there is no future with me" to "should I not seek rest for you?" The shift is not sentimental, it is moral and relational. Naomi is able to contribute to life again. The women spoke the final interpretation. The book begins and ends with the women of Bethlehem speaking around Naomi. When she returns from Moab, the women ask, "Is this Naomi?" Their question creates the setting for her Mara speech. Near the end, after Ruth bears a son, the women speak again, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." The same community that heard Naomi define her return as empty now names what has become visible within her household. They do not tell her that she never suffered. They do not command her to admit that the graves were secretly good. They bless the Lord for present covenant faithfulness. They name Ruth's love. They speak of life continuing into Naomi's old age. Their words do not merely celebrate a birth. They answer the social and theological isolation of Naomi's earlier speech. At the beginning, Naomi interpreted her life alone before the women. At the end, the women help interpret the life now placed before her. This communal voice is significant because Naomi has no recorded final speech. She does not stand before Bethlehem and ask to be called Naomi again. She does not offer a polished explanation of why God allowed Moab, widowhood, or the deaths of her sons. She does not repeat her words from chapter 1 and correct them line by line. The book lets the community speak, then shows Naomi receiving the child and caring for him. Her silence should not be treated as an empty space that the reader must fill with an imagined testimony. It is part of the literary resolution. Naomi no longer needs to control the meaning of the scene through a speech. At Bethlehem's entrance, language had become a way to set the boundaries of her identity. Call me Mara, because bitterness is the truest name I can bear. At the end, she receives what the women say without supplying another name. The narrator has already continued calling her Naomi through the entire book. The women now name covenant faithfulness around her. Naomi's action is receptive. This is a different ending from the familiar pattern in which a suffering person must explain the lesson for everyone else. Scripture does not require Naomi to turn her bereavement into a sermon. It does not make her responsible for proving that restoration has succeeded. Her place in the renewed household is shown rather than announced. The child will not replace Elimelech, Mahlon, or Chilion. Ruth's love does not erase the distinct relationships Naomi lost. The women's statement that Ruth is better to her than 7 sons does not make sons disposable. It honors a daughter-in-law whose covenant loyalty had been underestimated by the categories of family, nationality, and visible power. The new chapter is not a copy of the old one. That is why Naomi can receive it without calling the former chapter unreal. Biblical restoration is not always the return of what was taken. In Ruth, it is the creation of belonging and continuity through a household Naomi could not have predicted when she arrived from Moab. Yet even this should not be turned into a guarantee that every bereaved person will receive Naomi's visible resolution. Ruth records a particular act of providence within Israel's covenant story, one that will extend toward David and eventually stand within the genealogy of Christ. The truth is not that every bitter season will end with the same gift. The truth is that Naomi's bitterness, however honestly spoken, was never given the authority to narrate beyond what it could see. The final interpretation did not belong to Mara. It belonged to the story God was still carrying, to the covenant kindness embodied through faithful people, and to the scripture that had never stopped calling her Naomi. Scripture kept the name she could not carry. Naomi's bitter season was not dismissed. The book gave her words room to remain sharp. It did not explain the deaths, rebuke the lament, or demand a grateful performance before the next chapter could begin. It also did not call her Mara. Scripture followed the movement of her voice with patience. She blessed others before she could imagine blessing near herself. She named bitterness when bitterness filled her horizon. She later recognized kindness that had not forsaken. She sought rest for Ruth, counseled waiting, and finally received the words spoken by her community without producing a final defense of God. Naomi never publicly reclaimed her name. The narrator had been keeping it for her. That does not mean every wounded person secretly feels pleasant beneath the pain. It means a season, even a devastating one, cannot see far enough to issue the final name. Naomi's lament told the truth about the chapter she was living. It could not tell the truth about every chapter still unwritten. The book of Ruth leaves us with a restrained form of hope. Grief may speak honestly, but it is not the narrator. It may alter how a person sees God, the past, and the future, but it does not possess the whole story. Bethlehem heard her say, "Call me Mara." Scripture answered without argument. It simply kept saying, "Naomi,